There's a lot of mythologies around why the South is the way that it is, why places like the Mountain South, that's Appalachia, and the Ozarks, why they are the way they are. And in some of those mythologies, there are things that are true. There was a strong drive for independence for people. There was a desire for liberty. There was a desire for Jeffersonian ideal of a democracy or a republic of yeoman farmers, and that land was going to be the drive for independence. Some of these impulses are there and they're true, but they're also balanced by things that are also equally problematic, right? So we look at the legacy of enslavement, we look at the legacy of removal, we have the legacy of unintended consequences.
You're listening to The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place. My name is Mike Rush, and today we're spending time with Dr. Jared Phillips, author, historian, and someone who knows this land, the Ozarks, not only as a scholar, but as someone who has been shaped by its ridges, its rhythms, and its relationships. As we've journeyed through the early histories of Northwest Arkansas, through the voices of indigenous leaders, cultural historians, and the descendants of early settler families, we've been asking, how did this place become what it is today? What forces, seen or unseen, have shaped its identity? In this conversation with Dr. Phillips, we pause at a critical moment in the story. This is a bridge episode, a moment to step back and ask not just what happened, but how it began to form the cultural identity of our region. Because the people who first came to these hills didn't just bring their families or wagons or livestock. They brought a worldview. They brought memory and belief and myth, and a desire to build something in their own image. And those early settlers, those who came to this rugged, rocky terrain, came with an ethic that would become the foundation of an Ozark mythology, a belief in self-sufficiency, in distance from power, and in a certain ruggedness, real or imagined. We still have more to work through in the early history of Northwest Arkansas. We're not done with that yet. There are more stories to uncover, more truths to name. But we introduce this conversation now because it helps us see where we're going. The ideas explored here, the agrarian roots, the economic limitations, and the cultural framing of quote-unquote hill people, these aren't footnotes. They're the beginning of a story that we're still telling. So in part one of my conversation with Dr. Phillips, we're going to introduce the Ozarks as both a geographic place of identity and also a cultural place that begins to develop as these early white settlers begin to arrive in the 19th century and take root into the early 20th. This is not a complete conversation about the cultural identity of the Ozarks, so we'll be returning back to Dr. Phillips in further episodes as we approach closer to the modern era. But for now, we invite you to lean into this foundation because it's here that the Ozarks began to imagine themselves. All right, a lot to get through. Let's get into it. All right, Dr. Phillips, welcome. Thank you for sharing a table with me. I'm incredibly humbled to be able to just sit here with you. We're talking about the story of Northwest Arkansas, and I know this has been an area of deep focus for you, your doctoral studies, your writings, and we've been asking a lot of questions about where we are today and what is the state of Northwest Arkansas. And so this conversation to me is really the time that we have to focus on this question about really what happened before we got to where we are today. But before we begin, I would love to, number one, say welcome. Thank you for sharing this table. But
Yeah, you bet.
number two, tell me your story. I'd love to hear your background and how did we arrive at this place?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my wife and I, we are multi-generation Arkies. So we go back at least 5 generations, probably a little bit longer than that. And my people are from south of the Arkansas River down outside of Logan, in the Logan County region, which used to be considered part of the Ozarks. And then sometimes it's still not. And then my wife's people are from up here in the northwest part of the state, Oklahoma. And I think we take our heritage quite seriously in the sense that we're proud to be from Arkansas. We're proud to be from the mountain country of Arkansas. And we are proud to try to figure out how to uphold the values that we feel like our families have passed on and our communities have passed on. but also trying to figure out ways to bring those values forward into an era that's got a better way of thinking about everything, life, love, nature, whatever the case may be. Yeah.
I would be remiss if I didn't notice that obviously the work that you've done academically is tied to who you are and the origins of your own story. And so I guess in many ways, I'm curious, what's the origin? Give me some insight behind the drive of that. Is this simply an exercise in trying to understand yourself and I know that's not, I'm just kidding, but yeah, give me some insight into this duality in many ways of your academic study with your own personal background story.
Yeah, they say all scholarship is autobiography, and that at the end of the day, no matter what we're doing, we're trying to understand ourselves. And I don't know if it's true for all of my academic colleagues. I think it is true for myself. When I started as a historian, I actually did not write on Arkansas, at least directly. I worked on foreign policy and on Jimmy Carter. And so but if you talk about Jimmy Carter, you have to talk a lot about the South and you have to talk a lot about religion, because Jimmy Carter takes being from the South very seriously. And he takes being a man of deep faith very seriously. And so I spent a lot of time digging into the backstory of Southern Baptists, which is what I grew up as. And then I also, like I said, I'm a proud son of the mountains, and I grew up hearing different stories like all of us around here did, from grandparents and neighbors and old men in hardware stores. And just over time, I became more and more, really, as my wife and I decided to anchor ourselves more and more deeply here, I became more and more invested in the history of the place. I'm prone to picking hills to die on argumentatively. And so I was already doing that anyways. And then now I was able to find some way to make it feel a little bit more legitimate. But at the end of the day, it's really, I'm trying to understand my home and understand where my home is going. And through that, understand maybe what the future that my family will face. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious as you think about it. We're going to get into a lot of these conversations about the founding of the state of Arkansas and what that looks like in the Ozarks. But if you were to look down the road, what would you hope the outcomes of your work and your study could be?
Oh, man, that's a great question. What I would hope is that my work as a historian and my work as an active member of my rural community helps to preserve the good things of traditional Ozark life. There's not everything in Ozark history, and I'm sure we'll get into this, but not everything in Ozark history is pretty, and it needs to be preserved as a teaching tool, and so that we can count the cost of how we got here, but it doesn't need to be preserved as a way of being. But there are plenty of things in our place that I would hope don't get lost as we push towards whatever this drive of modern life is pushing us towards in the region.
I'm really curious if maybe we can start with helping place the beginning of this country and how that connects us to the South and to our state and ultimately to the Ozarks. And I know it's a lot of history to go through. We'll step through that, but give me a framework or a context of how to think about into where potentially where we can get to where we're headed today.
What I would say is there's a lot of mythologies around why the country is founded, why the South is the way that it is, why places like the Mountain South, that's Appalachia, and the Ozarks, why they are the way they are. And in some of those mythologies, there are things that are true. There was a strong drive for independence for people. There was a desire for liberty. There was a desire for this Jeffersonian ideal of a democracy or a republic of yeoman farmers, and that land was going to be the drive for independence. And some of these things, some of these impulses are there and they're true, but they're also balanced by things that are also equally problematic, right? So we look at the legacy of enslavement, we look at the legacy of removal, we look at the legacy of unintended consequences. There's so many works of history that tell us that when explorers show up here and they do things like they had done back in England or in France, but all of a sudden it changes the ecological foundation here, and then they have to pivot and move. So it's hard to pick one central theme that I would say organizes us. What I would say is I can tell you how I think about history. And I tend to think about history through what we call an agrarian lens. And so most people today, when they think about agrarianism, are probably familiar with either the weird cottagecore boom on Instagram during the pandemic, which I do not have much time for, or they think about the work of thinkers and writers. People like Wendell Berry potentially would be probably somebody who comes to mind. And Mr. Berry, he's a seminal figure in the movement. He, like all writers and thinkers, has got his flaws in his philosophy. But that agrarian component, so like thinking about life rooted most likely in a rural existence, most likely in a community of people engaged on building a life in that place, a life that stretches across generations, and increasingly thinking about what a life across generations mean is not just between human generations, but the generations of the trees, of the waterways, of animals, stuff like this. That's how I tend to think through history. That's the approach. And the stuff that I've published and the stuff I'm working on right now, that's the approach that I come back to, is how do I understand the movement of time, the progress of changing consequence in that lens? That's how I approach it.
Arkansas has grown out of that agrarian
100%.
Foundation, if you will. And so even though maybe the reality of our world today looks very different, especially in Northwest Arkansas with global companies affecting global commerce, but as you think about that agrarian environment, like I've heard you talk about this idea of the global South. Can you explain that, what you mean by that?
Yeah. So the global South, if you grew up hearing phrases like the third world or the developing world, that's what the global South is essentially. In the 1980s and the 1990s, as the Cold War was coming to an end, policymakers at the World Bank and at the UN were trying to figure out a way to better understand some of these big macro problems that we're facing the planet. Poverty, increasingly we're thinking about climate change, education, healthcare. And they came up with this thing called the Brandt line, named after the former German Chancellor, Willy Brandt. And basically everybody north of that line is probably a developed country, but not always. And everybody south of that line is probably an undeveloped country, but not always, because there's always exceptions to the rule. And I don't know, it's just as tricky of a terminology as developed and undeveloped or first and third world. None of these terms are perfect, but scholars of the American South and rural America do tend to pay attention to this. One, because we are not unconnected from the world, especially if you live in the place that's the headquarters of Walmart and Tyson and J.B. Hunt. Like, you have to understand those connections. But two, so often, so many of the places in our region, statistically, at least in comparison, match some of these underdeveloped spaces in the global South, places that have persistent levels of poverty, persistent problems in healthcare access, persistent levels of disease and addiction, massive gender imbalances, education, all these things are there. We see similar problems reflected here, right? So some of the work that I've done in the classroom and with like study abroad training and training of students and stuff has been to help kids think through. You could be a kid from Arkansas, a landlocked state that until really recently didn't have a direct international connection, but you can still learn lessons about the world because we're not in a way that dissimilar to a whole big mess of the world. And so that's how I think about the global South. Yeah.
You mentioned this a little bit, but what are some of those influences that I think maybe are generally true, if that's fair, across the South that are definitely true when we come to the state of Arkansas?
Yeah. So we're a colonized place, right? And so other people can speak into this better than I can, but we are the product of European colonization. And what that means, there was a long period of Native American removal, and then there was a period of the spread of enslavement, both of Native American people and then also citizens of various communities in Africa were brought over here. That's the bulk of how we think about our regional development up until the Civil War. And I'm speaking very generally, right? And then after the Civil War, the long-range impact of setting up a slave-based agricultural economy impacts how we think about industry, impacts how we think about the use of resources, impacts how we think about political equity. All of these things are impacted there. So colonialism is one of these long-range impacts. The impact of an agricultural system that depends upon unpaid labor is problematic across the South. It sets up the foundations for what will become sharecropping, which in turn sets up the foundation for, you can make the case, certainly, and I think the case is there to be made. It sets up the foundation for everything about modern contract farming, which we see through a lot of the large sort of industrial confined animal operations. So that's a long-term impulse that we see there. I think when we get across the Mississippi River, we don't have some of the long-range impact of the slave legacy that the true deep South has, but we still have it. We still have slaves in Arkansas. Nowhere near the numbers of, say, Georgia or South Carolina. We still have a heavy presence of slavery, particularly in the south and eastern part of the state. But we also get to share a different legacy. We share the legacy of frontier expansion a little bit. We border Oklahoma, was Indian territory, became a place where so many of the nation's removed peoples were frankly just dumped and then ignored for the next several decades and centuries. But that gives us a little bit of a frontier mythology, though, right? So a former colleague of mine, Dr. Elliott West, likes to talk about Jesse James. Jesse James is one of the iconic frontier outlaws. He's from Missouri. But when we think about his story, he's like in Kansas or Colorado somewhere. But he's really a hillbilly gone amok. But we have these historic legacies of thinking about slave economy, agricultural, the style of large scale agricultural, slow systems. We've got the legacies of colonization because like elsewhere, we're dealing with not just Americans coming over the Mississippi, but before that, we have French guys in the region. Then we have Spanish folks in the region. Then we have the Louisiana Purchase and all this kind of stuff going on. And then we have the Western expansion. And then I think we also, because we're a poor mountain place. And by poor, I don't mean economically. That is also true. Our soils are not strong in the Ozark Mountains where we are here. And so we share a legacy similar to Appalachia. And so we become these weird, we get to hold on to these funny mythologies in American life. Hillbillies have to have mountains, essentially. They got to have hills to be a hillbilly, right? And so we get to hold on to hillbillies like Appalachia, all of the weirdness that comes with that. But in a way, because of the mixing of these legacies, the mixing of other legacies as well, it means that we hang on to not that we hang on to, but that we're given a job by the country that we didn't really ask for and that we've had to deal with. And that is that we hold on to a mythic American past here, and that we're the place you go if you want to find self-sufficiency. We're the place that you go if you want to find that mythic Scots-Irish perfect language of our Anglo-Saxon forebears who came across the water. I don't know, that's a lot at one time, I think.
Yeah. And keep going. I feel like this idea of this frontier aspect, I mean, we have European settlers coming in up the Mississippi and down the Mississippi into these agrarian agricultural spaces in early Arkansas, obviously displacing Native American communities there. Are these the same people that then move into the Ozark regions? Or do we see a different influence of people coming in?
Yeah, that's a good question. On the eve of statehood, the state of Arkansas had, I just looked this up earlier today. I don't remember now. We didn't have very many people. 1803, 1807, we had something like 500 white people in the state of Arkansas. And then that starts to jump almost at an algorithmic level over the next several years. But we have very few white people in the region. The Ozarks in particular, which span across most of North Arkansas, a little bit of eastern Oklahoma, and then up in the bulk of south central Missouri, the Ozarks. As a rule of thumb, nobody is permanently living, no white settlers are permanently living in the Ozarks really till the 19th century as well. I mean, you see some French mining efforts in the 18th century, but for the most part, this is all open hunting ground that's dominated by the Quapaw on the south and largely by the Osage up along the Osage River in Missouri. And they're in competition with one another for power over the region, but then they're also being pushed by the imperial struggles across the Mississippi, and they're being pushed by the continued arrival of Americans, especially after the Revolution, where we have Americans. And that's going to start to change it and start to change what we see happening. But the bulk of early folks that show up in the state of Arkansas and that will gradually wind their way into the Ozarks are people coming out of places that look like the north part of Arkansas. So they're coming out of Tennessee, Georgia, the Carolinas, the mountain parts of Carolinas, and they're coming at light. Some historians like to say that light calls to like a little bit, and that makes sense. I don't know that I would want to write a book based on that.
Yeah,
but that there's at least a similarity and a familiarity until they can understand how to succeed. Any big planting cultures emerging along the Mississippi River on both sides that are sharing economies, sharing cultures, and as they move through there. And so those planting classes are not moving north into the hills, west into the hills. They need a different sort of land. They need a different sort of market access. The folks that are coming up into the hill country are coming out of hardscrabble communities, and they're being pushed as well. This is a story that we have to remember, that we're pushing native populations out. And usually who's pushing native populations, it's a combination of wealthy folks, military struggles, and then poor folks that are coming from the old world over and trying to make a living here. And then those folks are also going to get pushed later. And so then they're going to come across. And then they're also joined by other new settlers. Arkansas is going to get a whole big contingent of German settlers at some point. We're going to get Italian settlers at some point. But for the most part, the Ozarks are attracting, in the scheme of wealth and sort of internal movement, we're attracting a poorer community because we're a poor ground in a way, right? And I want to be careful how far we would push that. But the academic in me is saying, don't make too big of a statement on that. But
yeah. I've heard you refer to Arkansas as basically three regions.
Yeah.
And I think my question is rooted in both the evolution of these regions, but also I'd love for you to maybe unpack them and maybe even define, if you will, When we think of Arkansas, I think many of us want to think of Northwest Arkansas as a region, right?
Yeah.
Maybe connected or not connected to the state or the Delta, or
Depends
right
on where we are in the football calendar, right?
Yeah. That's true. But help me understand when we think maybe geographically or even from an identity standpoint, how people think about what this state is.
Yeah. So geographically, we can think about the state in three. I tend to think about it in three regions. Some people think about it in four. I think about it in three regions because I'm frankly not smart enough to hold the four in place. But so you have the whole eastern side of the state. So that's running along the Mississippi River. This is going to be today. This is the heart of our rice, soy, cotton economy. That's what we're talking about here. This is also the ancestral heart of the slave economy of Arkansas is there. Then we have the southern and southern central, southern southwest part of the state, which is increasingly rocky and mountainous, but that's dominated by the pine timber operation, still more of a slave presence than you see in the northern part of the state. And I should be clear, not because the northern part of the state was opposed to slavery. It's just that for the most part, slave owners in Arkansas only had one or two slaves. The vast majority of slave operations in the state were at that smaller scale. Then you have a bunch of people that are in that 20-ish, they've enslaved 20 some odd people. And then you do have outliers that own several dozens and hundreds of people, but they're the exception. In the Ozarks, we have very few that even make it to that 20, the number of 20 enslaved people at 20. So we've got that deep soil. It's being worked by slave labor. We have a similar band of soil that's moving to the rocky timber country in the southwest part of the state that begins to develop a timber extraction economy in the 19th century. In the 20th century, it'll also develop an oil economy. And then we have the northwest part of the state. So depending on who you are, that's beginning just south of Fort Smith, running through the bottom of Sebastian County, down across over through Franklin and Logan County. And then it's going to peel up around along the Black and Strawberry Rivers out on the eastern edge. Then it rolls, the hill country just rolls right on up into Missouri. But those are the three regions that I see. Some people also say that you should consider taking the Arkansas River out as a distinct cultural space. To me, it crosses and it reflects the places that it crosses these other regions as well, and it reflects them. And so I don't tend to think about it in that particular way. But you're not wrong if you do. Each of the three regions is going to develop in its own way. I would say that the western half of the state includes the Ozarks, includes that southwest part, is more culturally similar than it is to themselves than they are to the eastern part of the state, because we can't support historically or today the type of industrial agricultural system that they have there. It's a very different system. And so what I tend to tell people is that if you divided the state basically by rocky spots and not rocky spots, the not rocky spots tend to look east across the Mississippi for how they're starting to think about things. And then the rocky spots tend to look towards either inward on themselves, or we look toward Oklahoma into the plains. That's how we think about it. And so I think about that even in the context of where my neighbors sell livestock. They don't bring livestock into the middle part of the Ozarks to sell at a cattle barn. They take them to stuff that's on the border or right over the border in Oklahoma, because that's where the markets are for it. So we're livestock country and small crop country, not big plantation style country. So, yeah.
Okay. So we think about the Ozark region, define that for me.
Yeah, the Ozarks, broadly speaking, are around 50,000 square miles. Like I said, they're Arkansas, Oklahoma, Missouri. To be totally fair, there's a tiny little fraction that's in this very southeastern corner of Kansas. And there's some debate about whether or not Illinois gets to have some of it. I'm looking at a map of the Ozarks on my wall right now as I'm saying this. The Ozarks are like most places in the world. We're not that unique in this, in that there is a geographic or a geologic definition of us, and then there is a cultural definition of us. And so geographically or geologically, the parts south of the Arkansas River would not technically be considered a part of the Ozarks, but culturally they absolutely should be. And I make that claim for two reasons. One, very good historians and cultural anthropologists would suggest that, and my grandfather also believed that. And that's where he was
probably all the authority you need.
That's all I need right there. But the Ozarks historically are, and then we can break that broad chunk of the Ozarks up into some more discrete areas. And so if you're listening to this and you're in Arkansas and you live in Washington, Benton County, you're in the very southern end of what's called the Springfield Plain, which kind of starts here in East Oklahoma. And in Washington, Benton counties in Arkansas, a little bit in Madison and Carroll. And then it goes up towards Neosho and Joplin, and then hangs sharply to the east and out towards Springfield, the Springfield Plain. That's probably the best agricultural ground in the place. So if you think about where there is commercial cropping of any type, the bulk of it is there. It's not to say that doesn't occur elsewhere in the river bottoms and the other parts of the Ozarks, but it's the easiest country to work in. The terrain is not as severe. And so that's one of the reasons why we see the type of urban, semi-urban development of Springfield, Joplin, Neosho, Bentonville, Rogers Springdale, Fayetteville. This because you can simply get around. So it's easier to build roads here. You move into the interior of the Ozarks, so we're moving east. So we're moving from west to the east, moving to the interior of the Ozarks, so into the White River Valley area. In the Arkansas side, we have the Boston Mountains. And so this is going to stretch like the Buffalo River down to the edge of the plateau. Most people would argue when you look at the topographic relief that this is some of the roughest country, if not the roughest country in the country, because of the rate of elevation change, the rate of elevation loss and gain that we see per square mile. You really would be hard pressed to find somewhere else in the contiguous 48 that can beat it. That's not to say there's not lots of rough country elsewhere, but man, we take the cake. And that's a function of a history that's 1 billion years old. This is the discussion of uplift and erosion and everything. Because we're not properly speaking, we're talking about the Boston Mountains or the Ouachita Mountains or whatever. Properly speaking, hardly anything in the Ozarks is actually a true mountain range. And there's a little bitty corner up in Missouri, the St. Francois Mountains or St. Francis Mountains that are properly mountains, but they're very eroded today. And then in the Boston Mountains, and then everything else is still pretty rough through the rest of the Arkansas side of the Ozarks. And then up in the Missouri side of the Ozarks, it's still pretty rough and rocky. It's dominated by oak and hickory forests. That's been the ballgame for the last 200, 300 years. But that's the nature of the uplift, the nature of the forest, the nature of the soil quality has dictated how settlement has happened. It also in part dictated the way that Native American communities interacted with the space. This was a hunting ground, largely speaking. There are permanent settlements, but it's not the norm across the region. This is a great place to come and get white-tailed deer. This is a great place to come and get beaver. This is a great place in the day, way back in the day, to hunt bison and giant beavers and stuff like that.
Yeah. So you're talking geographically to give us a cultural identity, if you will.
Yeah. We touched on it a little bit earlier. The prevailing mythology of the place would have been set by the folklorist Vance Randolph, who affectionately is Mr. Ozarks. Although I think the historian Brooks Blevins probably has a viable claim on that title today. But Vance Randolph, through the publication of his works, and a couple other folklorists at the time, Otto Rayburn over in Kingston and Eureka, they help establish a mythology of what we look like as a region. And this is building on the old Arkansas Traveler song, if you're familiar with that. We're poor, we're self-sufficient, we're probably ignorant, we're probably a little bit on the lazy side. And we work just hard enough to not die, but not hard enough to be a good member of the American sort of rational land management system.
Well, yes. Now, I had to go to law not long ago about this house of mine.
Well, did you have a smart lawyer?
You just bet I did. He owns the house now.
Say, I noticed a hole in the roof of your house. Why don't you have it fixed?
That it's been a-raining lately.
Yes, but why don't you fix it when it's not raining?
Yeah, when it don't rain, it don't leak. Oh.
Well, for pity's sake, why don't you play the rest of that tune?
Well, I just reckon you ain't no man living smart enough to do that.
Oh, yes, there is. Now, I think I can if you let me. Ah, thank you.
Well, by Chowder stranger, you're the smartest man living. Come right in. You're welcome to anything in my place. Come right in.
Now, what I would say to that is that all mythology has a little bit of truth in it. So there absolutely are people like that. We can look at the diaries of explorers that come through in the early 19th and mid 19th century, and they are absolutely encountering people that fit that stereotype perfectly. The vast majority of people that live in the Ozarks from the middle end of the 19th century up until the massive change that we see at the end of the Cold War, so 1980s and 1990s, they are the descendants of this sort of hardscrabble imagery, and they are themselves a hardscrabble people. The Ozarks, culturally, we are a place where you make do, but you don't generally get rich. You're proud of the work, you're proud of your community, whatever that work is. It doesn't have to be farming. The Ozarks is a largely rural space. And the majority of people that live in a rural space are not actually farmers. And this is sort of truism in the data, but lots of small farming. When we have farming in the Ozarks, it's lots of small farming. Mid 20th century, there's plenty of people though that are engaged in industrial work here and there, but it tends to be a fiercely independent place, contrarian traditionally, both in religion and in politics. So you can look at the various types of religious experiences that you see here, from Hilltop Baptists and Holy Rollers to Universal Unitarians and Quakers that have been here for decades and decades, Catholics. There's a healthy Jewish population in Little Rock for a long time. And there's a Jewish population that's moving around in Springfield. A colleague of mine has done she's just done some tremendous work on that as well. And it's a fiercely independent place. Like we were talking about earlier, the basic idea here is that you take care of yourself, you take care of your neighbor. And as long as your neighbor's not doing something that's causing direct harm to you or the community, you just leave them alone. And that has brought with it a certain political culture that was relatively steady for most of the 20th century. It changes like so many things do in the 1980s and the 1990s, where there was a healthy disregard for any and all people who were promising silver bullet solutions, be they political or economic. But that changes in the 1980s and the 1990s, which is a whole different story. But yeah.
I want to go back to something you said about the Ozarks. You said that we hold this kind of, or we're asked to hold this mythic American past.
Yeah.
How does, help me understand the context of that?
So this is particularly true as we move into the late 19th century and through the 20th century. And I would argue even still today, although what we mean by that mythic past has shifted just a little bit in the last 30 years or so. But if you think about what the American dream is, the American dream as we think about it is really perfected as the 20th century comes into being. And it's a really simple kind of thing. It is not actually to be a self-made millionaire like Andrew Carnegie. That's awesome. This is great, good for him, but that's actually not the dream. Most people understand that's an outlier kind of situation. The dream really is when you look at all of the advertising and PR money that's spent over the 20th century, it's to be upper middle class, to pass as super wealthy, but to really you're just middle class, right? And so there's all these trappings in it. Right. But one of the things that is interesting, at least to me and to people who dig into this stuff, is that it also always seems to need a foil, because middle class existence in American life en masse only really comes into being after the Second World War. We talk a lot about the power of the New Deal. The New Deal is this incredible moment in American history. It's incredible in places like Arkansas and Missouri. But the New Deal does do a lot to pull people out of poverty and pull them into a sort of a middle class. But it's really the combination of the New Deal setting a floor and then the Great Society programming of Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s that actually creates the American middle class. That middle class is brand new and they're afraid of going back into poverty. They're also all the kids or they were young adults during the Depression. So they know what that means. But they also know that those people are their grandparents or their parents, and they have fond memories of going to the farm and for Christmas or helping with the cow or picking strawberries or whatever the case may be. And so on the one hand, we're holding up the idea, the mythology of the American dream, because it is a mythology. There's nothing wrong with it. All nations have to have a mythology to have cohesion. But it is a mythology, and like all mythologies, it can be dangerous. But it has to hold up. On the other hand, a mythology of what it is better than. And what it is better than is the dirty, ignorant hillbilly tucked up in the backwoods who's afraid of progress and can't get on in the modern world. And so but if you eradicate that entirely, then you no longer have anything that you've set yourself as better than or as like improving from, right? And so folks that work on the hillbilly mythology and the hillbilly image in American life, myself included, we tend to see the hillbilly is standing as the foil for the American dream. And so it has to be maintained even if it's not real.
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah.
Explain that. What do you mean? Like you talk about it being maintained. Where do we see that?
Yeah. So there's two versions of the hillbilly that are kept forward in American life throughout the 20th century. One of them is deliverance, which we've all seen or heard of, or we've heard of dueling banjos, and we don't really need to go there. But it's that dangerous, ignorant, reactionary person in the backwoods who seeks violence above all. And that's a version of the hillbilly that I think most people can get behind. Yeah, we don't ever want to go there. We don't want that. But then there's the comedic, idiotic hillbilly. And so we've all seen Beverly Hillbillies. And I don't mean the horrible movie from the late 90s or early 2000s, the show. They're Ozarkers. They come from the Arkansas, Missouri Ozarks, and they go to California. And so it's not even that hillbillies in general are given to they're the laughing stock. They're ignorant. They can't figure anything out. their simple homespun charm can only get them so far. It's our people, it's Ozark people that are given to the nation as that's the foil, right? And Appalachia gets the mean people. We get the funny ones. But in a way, I think that was more dangerous for us in our community because it creates that mythology. If you're trying to create a dream and convince people to buy into what this American dream is, you have to show that not just economically, not just in education, but that in all facets, you are better than what you're coming from. And if you figured out a way, if by the 1960s and by the 1970s, mountain poverty is still a very real thing. It's still a very real thing today, but it's lessening to the extent that people aren't necessarily super worried about it anymore. At least if you're not living in the place, then you have to figure out a new way to weaponize that old hill folk image, and so you turn it into something funny. Man, Granny is funny. Jed Clampett's funny, but boy, we don't want to be like him. But boy, we'll turn it on the TV and we'll watch him and we'll laugh with him. Andy Griffith even can exist in this a little bit, right? He's a little bit more Law and Order, though, right? He's representing a sort of a bridge between that comic, comedic, kind of folksy world that should be mocked and left behind into something that could be aspired to a little bit, right? But even that's still a mythic. It's still a made up kind of thing.
Yeah, I'd love for you to keep going because I'm not from here originally. I've been here for a long time, but compared to others, not compared to many of them.
If it's all right.
I don't know. Well, but I'm drawn to this idea that you have here because it's both an image that I feel like is placed upon people in this region, but in some ways also an identity that people may want to cling to. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I call myself a hillbilly. I don't have any problem with that. I'm careful because I'm a historian. In my mind, I always have 9 footnotes. I'm like, I'm a hillbilly, but I'm not this, I'm not this, I'm not. Yeah. So this imagery is put upon the region. And to be clear, Appalachia is getting the same treatment as well. But we do get it. We do share the experience to a degree, but we do have our own kind of unique storyline within it. The idea of the hillbilly is being put upon us over and over and over again, and it causes problems. So chambers of commerce across the region are not happy about this. They're not, but they don't really know what they can do about it. Especially when people start to say, all right, if this is who we are, we might as well make some money on it. And so this is why if you drive from here to Branson or here to Springfield or wherever, the roadsides, especially if you're not on the major highways, are awash with some version of a hillbilly, a caricature of a hillbilly for realty, for real estate agencies, a cafe, a gas station, a retirement village, a bait shop, whatever the case may be. And it's variety shows. You go to Eureka Springs and you've got the Ozark Mountain Jamboree, which no disrespect to the Ozark Mountain Jamboree, but its logo, its image is a bespectacled, bill-up, turned, barefoot, overall wearing hillbilly. And so they figure out how to make money on it. Great, good for them. This is not an economically thriving region, especially mid-20th century. But it is problematic for the long-term health of the place because we create a system that has to trade on a negative stereotype that's put upon us in order for us to thrive. Because we can't thrive agriculturally. There isn't an agricultural silver bullet here. We can't make the economic gains that Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Iowa are making with the advent of a lot of the new agricultural technologies in the 20th century. We'll start to make some of those gains thanks to the work of Tyson Foods, which on the one hand is this really important economic engine in the Ozark countryside. On the other hand, it's a really detrimental economic engine in the Ozark countryside. And I think some of that is unintentional. I don't think there was this effort, they're trying to make things worse. There wasn't a viable economic solution and there were unintended consequences, which is what a lot of what we study is historian unintended consequences of things. But if your whole cultural form is foisted upon you, and then you have to turn a caricature of yourself into an even worse caricature to be able to make a living at a regional level, and that spawns a sort of tourist experiential economy. So when people come out of Chicago or come from Memphis or they come into the Ozarks, they go float and fish and hike or whatever in the natural resources. They also want to see a hillbilly. They don't want to see a deliverance hillbilly. They want to see Jed Clampett, right? And so that colors how we think through it. And so that means then that people think that we don't have our own culture here. We don't have our own way of expressing ourselves, our artistic values, our philosophical values, what our heart and vision of our place is. It creates a problem for us. What will happen then is that means that it encourages more people to foist off more ideas on our place. And It's not like it's a one and then some time and then another and then some time. It's happening rapid fire. And so the 1950s, the 1960s are going on, and this idea of hillbilly Americana is happening. We've got radio shows in Springfield. We got the shows in Eureka, shows increasingly the tour Shepherd of the Hills booming and in Branson, voicing all that stuff on. That's presenting a particular image of the place that's built on the history of the removal of Black residents in the region. So we have this lily white space, has all these hillbillies who are traditional Americans. They're poor and they're silly. And isn't it great? We can go look at them and experience that and then go back to suburbia in Chicago until it's time to retire. And so we start to see retirement villages being born. We want to move back where there's no hippies, and we want to move back where there's no civil rights violations or anything like that. We want to go there. And then they come in and they bring all of their understandings of what our place is, even though that was never what our place was, with them. And then means that people like Gerald L.K. Smith, who's going to create the Passion Play over in Eureka Springs, the big crest of the Ozarks, this guy, he comes here in part because of this mythology that's here to build this sort of, I don't know, Christian nationalist tourism kind of idea. And we weren't calling it that at the time, but that's what it becomes, right? Or standing for it. And it's bought hook, line, and sinker by a particular brand of community booster in Carroll County. And it's part and parcel to this, like, to me, it's a really good example of how there are these, once that ball starts rolling, of this identity is foisted upon us, and then we have to figure out how to live with it. And then people start to use it as a way to make money, it furthers that cycle. It creates a cycle that keeps looping around, to where by the time we get to the end of the 20th century, early 21st century, we're seen as a blank comedic canvas. We got two things going. We got natural resources, and then we got no culture because we're just hillbillies. We got nothing here. So there's no conversation about the incredible artists that live here, that were born here, or that came into the region, have made a life here. There's no conversation about traditional singing that's been preserved here, that makes its presence known at the Smithsonian Festival for Arts in the 1960s. There's no discussion about the uniqueness of our folk art. So the paintings of people like S.E. Ward are totally disregarded in that kind of a deal. And sure, they're not Van Gogh, but they're unique and special to our place, right? And there's no reflection of the artistry that goes in the work of making a living in a place as hard as this. Because to live in a landscape like this, one, you've decided you're going to live here, or circumstances are such that you have no choice but to live here. But to live well here, and that living well can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. But to live well here means that at some point, you're no longer acting in a mechanical mode of existence. You have to find some type of artistic way of living. And that can be everything from how you think about growing your garden to the way that you think about, if you're in the 1950s, how do you think about utilizing a pair of horses in the logwoods, whatever that may be. There's all kinds of modes of being in the rural countryside, but it all boils down to the artistry of everyday life. That's its own worthy culture. Right. And Appalachia, in a way, Appalachia is a little bit better off than us in this, and that because of the way the national park system develops there, they're able to, it's still a problem. They commodify it, but they are able to commodify those things. The arts and crafts of daily life quickly become commodified there. Right. And that causes its own problem in Appalachia. And here, we don't see that evolve in quite the same way, in part because of the rapid fire change that we see over time.
Well, that's where we're going to pause for now. This is part one of our conversation with Dr. Phillips. We trace the contours of an identity that's still shaping our place. The Ozarks as a land of ruggedness, of resilience, and of contradictions. We explored the migration of white settlers into the hills of Arkansas, the mythologies that started to grow from that movement, and how these early decisions, economic, agricultural, and cultural, planted seeds for the stories that we still tell about this region today, and its identity that is preserved in our American story. Dr. Phillips reminds us that the Ozarks didn't just become the Ozarks by accident. The people that came here brought with them ideas about land and liberty and independence, ideas shaped by enslavement, indigenous displacement, and an agrarian ideal of a Jeffersonian republic. We talked about the ways that these ideas hardened into stereotypes, hillbillies and outlaws, backward folks, or comic relief, and how those stories became tools to both market and marginalize this place. I want to thank Dr. Phillips for his wisdom and his honesty, and the way he helps us see the layers beneath the surface. His voice is obviously one we'll be returning to, because the story of the emerging Ozark identity is far from finished. And as we continue the season of The Underview, we'll continue asking hard questions of how this place was shaped, by the land and by the people who came here, and by the people who were pushed out. Because to understand Northwest Arkansas today, we have to reckon with the forces that built it, from beneath the gravel roads to the halls of political power. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being the most important part of what our community is becoming. This is The Underview, an exploration in the shaping of our place.